The first step to making the Prism flower bracelet is to set the 14mm jellyfish stone into the setting. Now you're just going to have your setting with prongs side up on your bead mat. Place the stone down into the setting. It should fit pretty nicely with each of the prongs sitting in one of the little indents on the edge of the stone. Then you're going to pinch and pick that up, and you're going to take a pair of chain nose or flat nose pliers. You can use nylon jaw pliers if you like, but I don't mind just using the regular metal nose pliers. Place the bottom jaw of the pliers on the underside of the prong that you want to push down, and the top jaw of the pliers on the prong you want to push down, and then squeeze so that the prong gets pushed down. Then rotate the assembly in your fingers. Place your pliers on the jaw and squeeze. That prong was already a little bit down, but oops. This might happen at some point. If the stone slips out a little bit, just kind of work it back in. If you have to, you can pull these prongs back if you have to redo them. Just have to be very gentle to not scratch the surface of the stone. So you just keep rotating and repeating till all 4 prongs are down on the stone. The first part of the project we're going to work on is the beaded flower on the center of the bracelet. And now this is created by making a base that the stone will eventually sit in. And we're going to be starting with this center part of the base first and working our way around in peyote stitch, adding row after row out to the outside, and eventually adding these petals using bicones and seed beads, and then the larger petals with delicas and 15-ohs. The base is going to look like this. That's sort of the first few steps, and then this, and then eventually we'll get to the larger petals. Needle up a wingspan and a half of thread and pick up 8 of your cylinder A. Bring them down toward the end of your thread, leaving just enough of a tail to weave into the beadwork later so you can secure it and trim it. Then stitch through the first few beads again to get a loop set up. Going through 4 here. Pull your thread. Stitch through all of the beads once more in the loop to kind of lock it in place. Make sure you go beyond the tail thread when you stop working your way around. Trying to get the camera to focus here. Come on. For the next row, you're going to pick up 2 cylinder A and skip over the next bead in the loop of 8 beads and stitch through the one after that. You're going to repeat that step or that stitch 3 more times. So pick up 2 cylinder A, skip over the next bead in the loop and go through the one after that. So that's my second of those stitches. Here's the third one. Oops. The tail thread can kind of get in the way. I try to sort of pull it underneath and then hold it with my thumb and forefinger so that it stays out of the way. It's easier said than done, especially when your tail thread's coming out right where your working thread is coming out. Okay. And this is the last repeat here. I'm picking up 2 beads, skipping over the next bead in the loop, and going through the one after that. It's easy to mess this up because you already have beads from this round in place, and so it can get confusing as far as where you need to put your needle. But basically just skip over the one bead, stitch through the one after that, and then you're going to also do a step up through the bead after that, which is actually the first bead in that first pair of beads that you added in the round that you're finishing up. So that's a step up. This is establishing your base. Every time you finish a row, you're going to have to do a step up. So make sure that you don't lose that step up as you work around, or you're going to have problems. All right, the next row, for the next row, you'll pick up one cylinder A, then stitch through the very next bead. So I'm adding a bead in between the beads in the pair that I had added in the previous row. I'll pick up another cylinder bead, cylinder A, and stitch through the first cylinder in the next pair from the previous row. So those two little stitches, I'm going to repeat those 3 times. This is my final repeat. So this is the bead I'm stitching through to finish this stitch, and then I'm going to step up through the bead after that as well, which was the first bead I added in this round I'm finishing up. So that was steps 8 and 9. Step 10, I'm going to add pairs of 15As between all the up beads on the outside edge of this little structure. So I pick up 2 15As and stitch through the next up bead. And then repeat that 7 times for a total of 8 of these stitches. And I've stepped up through the first pair of 15As added. Next step is to add a cylinder A between each of these pairs of 15As. So I got my cylinder A, and I'm stitching through both 15As in the pair as if they're one bead. So that's the last one. And then I have to step up through the first cylinder bead added in this round I just finished. For this next round, pick up 3 cylinder A's and stitch through the next single cylinder A added in the previous round. Oops. Repeat that 7 more times for a total of 8. So going through this bead completes this last stitch. But then I'm also going to step up through the first 2 cylinder A's in that first group of 3 I added at the start of this round I just finished. After adding the last group of 3 cylinder A's, step up through the first 2 cylinder A's in that very first group of 3 cylinder A's added. Pick up 3 cylinder A's and stitch through that same cylinder A your thread is coming out of, which should be the middle cylinder A in the group of 3. And you're going to stitch through it in a sort of circular fashion so that the 3 new cylinder A's sort of just sit to the side of that bead. Then stitch through 1 more cylinder A in the base. Pick up a cylinder B and stitch through the first 2 cylinder A's in the next group of 3 that were added in the previous round. So then you'll repeat those 2 stitches 7 times for a total of 8. After adding the final group of 3 cylinder A's, weave over to the first cylinder B added. Pick up 3 cylinder B's, 1 bicone, and 3 cylinder B's. Stitch through the same cylinder B in a circular fashion and take up the slack in the thread, but don't pull too tight because there's the risk of the bicone cutting the thread. Then stitch through the first 3 cylinder B's added. Pick up 2 cylinder B's, 3 15-ohs, and 2 cylinder B's. Skip over the bicone and stitch through the second set of 3 cylinder B's and then the cylinder B in the base. Stitch through the next 3 cylinder A's and then the next cylinder B in the base to make an identical bicone petal. You'll repeat that 7 times around so you have a total of 8 of those petals. After adding the last bicone petal, stitch over to the next set of 3 cylinder A's and stitch through the first one in that group of 3. I was coming from this direction and then stitch up through this one. I'm working on the side where these groups of 3 cylinder A's are more accessible. Pick up 5 cylinder A's, 2 15-ohs, oops, the 15-oh didn't want to cooperate, and 5 cylinder A's. Skip the next cylinder A in the group of 3 and stitch through the third cylinder A in that group of beads. Then pick up 2 15-ohs and stitch up through the first cylinder A in the next group of 3. Then you'll repeat that 7 more times for a total of 8 petals. After adding the final pair of 15-ohs, like I am here, you're going to want to weave over to the first pair of 15-ohs over here. Bring your thread out there. So you can do that by either going around through this long part of the petal here, or you can just sort of weave through the next 2 cylinder A's in that group of 3 and then through the next 2 15-ohs. You want to be very careful that you start here with your peyote stitch for step 23. You want your thread to be coming out of the 15-0s when you pick up your first cylinder C to do peyote stitch. Now, I want to emphasize that's going to be the same thing for each of these 8 petals. Always check and make sure your thread is coming out of the 15-0s before you pick up your first cylinder C, not out of a cylinder A. It's very easy to mix that up. So you're going to pick up a cylinder C, skip the next cylinder A, and stitch through the one after it. The one you're stitching through is actually the first in the group of 5 that you picked up in the previous round. You know, in the previous round you had groups of 5 cylinder A's, 2 15-0s, and 5 cylinder A's. This was the first of one of those groups of 5. So I'll repeat that 2 more times. Pick up a cylinder C, skip over the next cylinder A, and stitch through the one after that. And then once more here. Alright, now I'm going to stitch through the first 15-0 in this pair of 15-0s without adding anything. And then I'm going to pick up another 15-0 and stitch through the next 15-0 and the next cylinder A. This is also super important. After you add that additional 15-0, you stitch through 2 beads. Excuse me. Now, like the first half of the petal, I'm going to peyote stitch 3 cylinder C's. So I'm going to pick up a cylinder C, skip over the next cylinder A, and stitch through the cylinder C after that. Pick up a cylinder C, skip over the next cylinder A, stitch through the cylinder A after that. Just careful about your thread wrapping around things. It's easy to get it caught with all the petals going on here. Pick up a cylinder C, skip over the next cylinder A, and to stitch through the pair of 15-0s. Alright, so that completes just that step for that petal. I'm going to do the same exact thing to these remaining 7 petals. When adding the final cylinder C, after you stitch through the last 2 15-0s, step up through the first cylinder C added. To get ready for the next round. And it's always a good idea when you finish a round to check and make sure that all your petals are even, that each side of your petal is symmetrical. And ultimately you're going to want these cylinder C's to be on the outside edge of the petal. So they might be flipped for the time being, but as you work around the next round, just flip them over so that they can be on the outside edge. It's really easy to get these petals off, get the peyote stitch off just by a little bit, and then have one side be uneven and not look the same as the other side. So just check each petal and make sure they're all the same before moving on to save yourself a lot of headache and pulling thread out later on if you realize down the line that you had a mistake. These are cylinder C's here that are flipped in, so I'm just going to flip them out and make sure I stitch through them when I do the next round. This next round, peyote stitch 2 cylinder B's individually though, so one at a time. Just pick up a cylinder B, stitch through the next cylinder C added in the previous round. Pick up another cylinder B and stitch through the next cylinder C added in the previous round. Then pick up a 15-0 and stitch through the 3 15-ohs at the top of the petal. You may find that you have to switch to a smaller needle for this step, especially with these Duracoat beads. They have a coating on them that sometimes makes the holes a little bit smaller. I'm just going to try a different bead and see if that helps. Yeah, that helped. But I also may end up having to switch to a smaller size needle. I think this is a size 11 that I'm using. So I've gone through all 3 of these 15-ohs, and I'm pulling tight because I want the difference in the size of beads to cause the petal to curve. Now I'm going to pick up a 15-oh, stitch through the next cylinder C, added in the previous row, pick up a cylinder B, stitch through the next cylinder C added in the previous row, pick up a cylinder B, stitch through the next cylinder C added in the previous row. Alright, now here, instead of trying to go through these 2 15-ohs again, I'm just going to reverse direction and stitch up through the adjacent cylinder C on the next petal over. And then I'll repeat this peyote stitch process with this petal here. I'll do that 7 more times for a total of 8 petals. After finishing the round of peyote stitch, step up through the first cylinder B added. I'm actually going to use pliers to pull that through. You may need pliers to get through some of these beads, and as I said before, you may need to switch to a smaller needle as well. So you're going to step up through this first cylinder B. And for this next round, you're going to pick up 5 15-ohs and stitch up through the next 15-oh toward the tip of the petal. Then stitch through the 3 15-ohs at the tip of the petal. Then pick up 5 15-ohs and stitch through the bottom cylinder A on the other side of this petal. Now stitch down through the next cylinder C. And then up through the adjacent cylinder C in the next petal and through the cylinder B after that, so that you can repeat the addition of the 15-ohs. After adding the last group of 5 15-ohs, weave over to the next petal. And you're going to want to work your way up to this space here, so stitch up through the cylinder A's on the inside of the petal so that your thread is coming out of the first sort of up bead on the inside of the petal. Pick up 111A and skip the next cylinder A that's down in the ditch and stitch through the next cylinder A that's sort of an up bead, like the one your thread is coming out of. Reverse direction and stitch through the adjacent cylinder bead on the other side of the petal. Then back through the 11-oh. then through the next up cylinder bead on that side of the petal. Make sure the thread doesn't wrap around the bead like that. And when you pull tight, what this 11-0 is going to do is it's going to cause your petal to become concave. From there, you'll weave down through the next couple of cylinder A's. Through the next pair of 15-0s between petals. And then up through the next few cylinder A's so you can get to the next spot to add the next 11A. So you'll repeat that process with all the remaining petals. Once you do that, you can weave in, secure, and trim any threads that you have hanging. The next step of the project is to work on the wristband. The wristband is made up of 2 ladders of tubular herringbone stitch with cylinder A's all along one ladder and 11-0s along the other ladder. You're going to be mixing the colors of 11-0s to create an ombre effect as you go along. To start the first herringbone tube, pick up 4 11-A's and bring them down toward the end of your thread. Leave a 12-inch tail for assembly later. Stitch through the first 2 beads again, and then tighten everything up so that you have 2 pairs of beads laddered side by side. Then stitch through the second pair again. And I sort of hold these in place while I stitch so that they don't lose the structure of the 2 pairs. Pick up 2 cylinder A's and stitch through the last pair of 11-A's again in a circular fashion to ladder these 2 pairs of beads together. Then stitch through those 2 cylinder A's again. Pick up 2 more cylinder A's and stitch through that last pair of cylinder A's again in a circular fashion to ladder those 2 pairs of beads together. Then stitch through that most recent pair of cylinder A's. Now bring the 4th pair of beads around so it meets up with the first pair of beads. And sort of have to pinch this in place gently to hold everything in place while I work. Stitch through that first pair of 11-O's. I'm coming down out of the cylinder beads, so I'm stitching up through the 11-O's. And then stitch down through the pair of cylinder beads again to ladder those 2 pairs of beads together. Come on, focus. Wants to focus on my bead mat. Okay. And then stitch up through that pair of 11-A's once more. So this establishes the 2 ladders of tubular herringbone. You're going to have the first ladder with 11-O's on it and the second ladder with cylinder A's on it. The second ladder with cylinder A's is going to remain having just cylinder A's on it for the entire length of this herringbone tube. These 11-A's are going to change color after the first 14 rows. Alright, so again the herringbone is pick up 2 11-O's, stitch down through the next 11-O in the first ladder, then stitch up through the top cylinder A in the second ladder, pick up 2 cylinder A's, stitch down through the next cylinder A in that second ladder, and then stitch up through the top 2 11-O's in the 11-O ladder in the first ladder. This is a step up. You have to do a step up every row. If you lose your step up, you're going to have a twisted tube, and that's not the desired look for this project. So the rhythm is pick up 2 beads, go down 1 bead, up 1 bead, pick up 2 beads, go down 1 bead, and then up 2 beads. The step up finishes every row. And if you get confused or disoriented and you forget where your step up is, look for where your tail thread is. If you do the laddering process exactly how I did it, your tail thread will be coming down out of the column of beads into which you need to do your step up. So you're going to be making 8 of these identical herringbone tubes, 4 on one side of the bracelet and 4 on the other side. They all start here and work out this way. So you're always going to be starting with your 11A, and then you're going to be incorporating your 11B mixed with the 11A, then your 11C mixed with the 11B, then your 11D mixed with your 11C, and then finally your 11E mixed with your 11D, and then eventually you'll end up just using your 11E to work your way out to the length that you need on the herringbone tube. So after you finish these 8 herringbone tubes, they'll all be joined in the center here, and after the joining process, that's when you add the flower and you actually put the stone into the flower during that process as well. This graph on page 14 of your directions shows how you're going to mix your colors of your 11Os as you build the herringbone tube. It starts down here. The start of your herringbone tube is going to have 14 rows with 11 A's. So that'll just be about an inch of tube with 11 A's all on ladder 1. Ladder 2 is always cylinder A's, so we're not even talking about them in this chart. It's always cylinders on that side. What changes is just the 11 O's. In this first section here, we're working from bottom to top, and the beads that are added are also shown, written out, and the numbers in these little steps over here correspond to the sections of the herringbone tube. So, for example, for this first section here, when you pick up the first pair of beads, you're going to pick up one 11A and one 11B. For the second pair of beads, the second row of this section, you're going to pick up two 11As. For the third row, you're going to pick up an 11B and an 11A. So same as that first one here, but in reverse order. And then in the next row, you're going to add two 11As, then etc., etc. So this shows you how to mix the beads so you get sort of a random look. So just follow this chart exactly when you're adding your rows of herringbone. One way that I find it's easier to work on each section is I'll just line up the pairs of beads that I need for that section on my bead mat so that I can just pick them up in order left to right and work my way from bottom to top in the same order as the section in the diagrams. So I just laid out these beads like 11A, 11B, 11A, 11A, 11B, 11A, etc. till I got to this spot here where the next section begins. Oops. And then I don't even have to think while I'm working. I can just do herringbone stitch and pick up this group of beads first, then this one, etc., etc. So I've just laid out my beads for section 2 of the herringbone, and I'm going to just add them in the order I have them laid out on the bead mat. Oops. It doesn't matter if you pick up the beads, if you lay them out this way, from right to left or left to right. Just be consistent with the direction that you pick them up. Always, if you choose left to right, always pick them up left to right. So that was section 2. So you can see the 3 different colors of seed beads here mixing. And I'll move on to section 3. Alright, so bring together 4 of your herringbone tubes, the ends, after you've made sure your count is the same on all of them. And you're going to want to have your thread coming out of the second to last row of your 11E's. So if you stepped up as you finish the last row like I have, you just need to back out of the last bead you stitched through. So your thread is coming out there. Pick up a 15-0 and stitch through the next 11E in that ladder of herringbone. Then pick up an 11E. Come on, focus. Alright, pick up an 11E and stitch up through the second bead, the second 11E down in the next herringbone tube over. Pick up a 15-0, stitch down through the next 11E, pick up an 11E, stitch up through that second to last one in the next ladder, pick up a 15-0, stitch down through that next 11E, pick up an 11E, stitch up through the second to last 11E in the next herringbone tube, and pick up a 15-0 and stitch down through that next 11E. Oops. Alright, so now those 4 ladders are joined on the front, or those 4 tubes rather. We want to join them on the back as well, so we're going to turn this over and stitch up through the second to last cylinder A, the one that lines up with the bead your thread is coming out of. Now we're not going to add any 15-0s between the beads in each ladder here. We're just going to stitch straight through the next bead in the ladder, then pick up a 15E, stitch up through the corresponding bead in the next tube, and down through the next cylinder A. I have to move this piece. I keep getting this thread caught. Okay. Pick up an 11E, stitch up through the next cylinder A in the next ladder, and down through the next cylinder A, and pick up an 11E, up through the next cylinder A, down through the next cylinder A, and then turn this and stitch up through the top 2 11Es in that first ladder like you're doing a step up. Try not to get your thread caught around your tube like I just have. Little tip. Okay, now those ends are joined, and just so you can see the whole thing, this is what it looks like on the end. This is where the clasp is going to go, next to the 11Es. You're going to join these ends to your flower and to the other herringbone tubes later on. Alright, next level of the join, I'm going to pick up one 11E, stitch down through the next 11E. So it should have been the 2 ones on the end of that herringbone tube. Pick up a new 11E, stitch up through the top 11E in the next tube over, and just repeat those 2 little steps all along this front side of the joined herringbone tubes. Oops. It's easy to get your thread caught around the other end of your herringbone tubes while you're doing this. Now turn it over to the back, and you're going to stitch up through that first cylinder A on the back side, then down through the next one, so we're not doing anything between these cylinders, we're just traveling. Then pick up an 11E, stitch up through the top cylinder in the next tube, and then down, pick up an 11E, just repeating this. And last one. And then once you get to the back to the first tube, you're going to stitch up through the top 11E and the herringbone. And then that 11E you added between the ladders on the end. In order to add the clasp, I'm going to weave over to that first 11E I added between ladders in that previous pass I just did. I'm going to pick up one 11E, stitch through the end hole on one side of the clasp, making sure my clasp is on the front side. Then I'm going to turn this over, pick up one cylinder A, and stitch through the first bead in that last row of herringbone. Then I'm going to stitch out through the second bead in that last row. Tighten this up. Oops. It's easy to get the thread looped around. I think I've actually stitched through my thread. If you stitch through your thread, you're going to have a hard time. Okay, I undid that. Alright, so tighten that up. Stitch back through that cylinder bead you just added, and then back through the hole of the clasp. Back to the front here. Stitch back through that 11E you just added. And then through that 11E between ladders. Again, so same direction you stitched through it last time, so that you'll see a thread on each side of that bead. Okay, now I'm going to reinforce that thread path later on, but it's just the one pass for now. I'm going to move on through the next herringbone tube, the end of it, over to this middle 11E that I added between the middle two ladders. Alright, now here I'm going to pick up an 11E, go through the middle hole of the clasp, turn this over, pick up another 11E, stitch through this corresponding 11E on the back side, pick up another 11E, and stitch back through the hole of the clasp. So I've got two 11Es there connected to that hole of the clasp. And then on the front I'm going to pick up another 11E as well and stitch through that same 11E between ladders again. So same direction, so you end up with thread on both sides. And I'm just kind of wiggling this as I tighten up the thread. And then I'm going to move on through the next herringbone tube end over to the 11E between the third and fourth herringbone tube. Then pick up one 11E, stitch through that last hole of the clasp, pick up one cylinder A, and then stitch into one of the cylinder A's on the end of this last herringbone tube, and then out through the other in that last row. Then back through the cylinder and back through the hole of the clasp, through the 11E on the front, and through the 11E added between the ladders in the same direction. So now what I'll do is I'll weave to the back side, working my way around here, and I'll go through each of these additions starting from the back, working to the front, just because I'm working around this direction, around these herringbone tubes to reinforce the thread paths. For this step, you can use the same thread you used to attach the clasp, or you can add a new thread if you don't have enough of that one left. You're going to want to work in the first herringbone tube, have your thread coming out of the second to last row here, like you started the step where the joining. You're going to stitch through that first 15B you added, and then down 9 more rows of herringbone, just straight down this column of beads, so that your thread is emerging from the 10th row down. So counting the end row, this is the 10th row from end. Pick up one 11A and stitch up through the first bead in the 10th row of the next herringbone tube over. Then stitch down through the adjacent bead in that 10th row. Make sure, double check it's at the 10th row. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yep. You don't want to get that wrong. So then just repeat this process 2 more times. And I'm going to double check the count each time I do it. As you join them together, it's going to get easier to tell that it's the same row, but this first place you're joining with these beads, it's not always easy to tell. All right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right, now from here I'm going to stitch through the second bead in that same 10th row in this herringbone tube. And then I'm going to stitch down through the next bead in that same column. So now my thread's coming out of a bead in the 11th row. I'm going to stitch up through the adjacent bead in that same row, in that same herringbone tube, and then back through that 11A I added between ladders, and then into the first bead in the 11th row in this next herringbone tube. You kind of have to angle your needle when you do this, up through the adjacent one in the same row, through this 11A, down through this first 11O in the 11th row of this herringbone tube, and then through the adjacent bead in that same row, back through this 11A, and then down through that 11th bead. Now from here, I'm going to stitch down 9 more rows. So from where my thread is coming out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, this guy right here. So I'm going to put my fingernail there to mark it, and then stitch straight down this column of beads and come out at that point. And then I'll repeat this process of adding the gold beads between, or the 11A's between, and then coming back through them to this ladder, and then I'll go down 10 more rows to do the next section, and you just keep doing that until you run out of herringbone tube where you don't have 10 more rows to go down.
Once you've got both sides of the bracelet joined and the clasp attached, you're going to be joining the ends of the herringbone tubes together like this. They're just going to abut each other. I'm going to be sewing the tubes together, and you'll be adding 11 A's in between as well. So coming out of the very first bead in the first tube of herringbone on one side, you'll stitch straight across into the corresponding abutting bead on the opposite herringbone ladder. Then reverse direction. This may require rearranging your piece on your bead mat to get the right angle to stitch through the adjacent 11A in the same herringbone tube, and then stitch through the corresponding 11A on that first herringbone tube. So I've got a thread between the beads that are going to abut each other for that join. Then I'm going to stitch down through one more bead in this same herringbone tube. I may end up needing pliers for this part as well. I'm going to pick up 111A and stitch up through the top bead, top 11A in the next herringbone tube over, then stitch directly across to the corresponding 11A in the tube across, then pick up another 11A, stitch through the adjacent or the corresponding 11A in the first herringbone ladder, in the first herringbone tube, so that I'm adding these 11As between the tubes. And I'm just going to tighten everything up like that. Then I'm going to stitch down through two more of these 11As. Now these are actually in the tube on this side. I've just gone down through those two, pulling tight every time I stitch through beads because this has a tendency to loosen up. I'm going to pick up another 11A and stitch up through the adjacent bead in this second herringbone tube. So this 11A is going to sit right below the first one I added there. And I'm going to stitch across through two 11As in the abutting herringbone tube. Pick up an 11A and stitch through the corresponding 11A in that first herringbone tube and down through a couple more 11As. I want to work my way over now to this side of these herringbone tubes, which needs to be attached. These two columns of beads are not attached yet. So I'm just working my way over there. This might not be the exact same thread path as in the directions, but I'm trying to give you an understanding of this process. So now I'm over here. I'm going to stitch directly across through just the first bead in that first row. I'm going to pick up an 11A, stitch through the first bead in the next herringbone tube, then directly across through the first bead in the abutting herringbone tube, pick up an 11A, stitch through this first 11A in that tube, then down through two more beads, pull this all really tight, pick up an 11A, stitch up through the last two beads in this herringbone tube, and then directly across if I can. I better really pull tight once I go through these beads in this tube directly across. I gotta go through one more, so I'm coming out of the second row. I'm gonna pick up an 11A. An 11A on there, and I'm gonna go down through these two rows on the end of this tube. This is the part where it starts to get really kind of hard to get through these beads sometimes. If you can get through just one or two at a time, that's fine. You might need to use pliers, you might need to switch to a smaller needle or just a stronger needle. And I'm going to work my way over this last set. So I'm connecting these right across. And I'm going to repeat the same process. Alright, and then I'm going to weave to the back by going through the herringbone, the cylinder A on the other side of the herringbone, next to the bead my thread is coming out of. Pull this tight, stitch into this cylinder A in the abutting tube, reverse direction, and stitch through the adjacent bead and then the bead directly across. And then I'm going to repeat the same process to add 11 A's between these cylinders and join the cylinder ladders together.
Alright, now is the best part where you get to put together your wristband with your flower and your jellyfish stone. So you're going to want to start with your thread coming out of one of the two beads on either side of the join. So it's going to be in the very first row of one of these herringbone tubes. You want to be coming out of the 11-no column all the way on one end, so this end or that end. And you want to be coming out of the first bead headed toward the opposite end of the bracelet, so headed toward the clasp. You're going to pick up one 11A. You're going to stitch through this beaded flower, not through any beads, but between there's these little spaces in the netting between these groups of 3 cylinder A's and the pairs of 15 O's in the very first part of the base here. So I'm passing my needle just through that space, not through any beads themselves. I'm going to zoom in just so you can see it better. Alright, so my needle's just going through the space between beads here. And pay attention to which side of the join you're on. I'm on the right hand side of the join. There's sort of this imaginary line I'm picturing where the herringbone tubes, the individual herringbone tubes abutted each other. I'm on the right hand side. I'm going through a space that ultimately is going to be on the right hand side of the flower. I'm going to end up utilizing the space right next to it as well, the one to the left. But I'm sort of trying to line this up. And then I'm going to line up my jellyfish stone so my 2 holes are running along the same direction as that sort of midline of the join. I'm going to stitch through the setting, straight through the right hand side of the setting as I'm looking at my stone face up. And I'm going to stitch through the the third space away from the first in the flower, just between the beads as I came through from the back side initially. I'm gonna now pick up another 11A, and I'm going to stitch through basically the mirror image bead from here, but on this side. So it's going to be the bead in the first row of this last herringbone tube. And then I'm going to stitch through the one after it, which is in the first row of the abutting herringbone tube. And I'm not going to tighten this all the way up yet so you can see where my threads are going. I'm going to pick up another 11A. I'm going to stitch through this space in the flower right next to the one I just came through, between beads, making sure I'm not stitching through any beads. And I'm going to then stitch through the second set of holes in the setting. And then I'm going to stitch through, I'm going to zoom in a little bit for this. I'm going to stitch through the space between beads right next to the one I passed through first. I can grab my needle. Make sure your thread doesn't get tangled on any of the petals. And then I'm going to pick up another 11A and stitch through the first bead on this side of this abutting herringbone tube, abutting the first. And I'm going to turn this around so I can really push this through. There. So I'm coming out now right where I started this whole process. And then I'm going to take up my slack finally. Make sure everything lines up nicely when I do. So I've got an 11A between each side of this join here. And if it's not tightening up, you may have to go through and tighten the parts individually, or it may be caught on something. Mine's not tightening up quite like I'd like it to, so I'm just pulling on the different parts, trying to get my thread. I'm having some slack right here, so I want this to tighten up here, then this one, then this one finally. Alright, and then you're going to retrace your thread path through all of those beads, which is going to require some manipulation, you know, really wrenching the beadwork around so you can get into these tight spaces. But make at least one more pass. I like to do at least 2 more passes actually. And once you do that, you will be finished.